Welcome to Bridging Gaps, the business podcast sharing the challenges and stories of fellow business owners.
Hello and welcome to Bridging Gaps, the business podcast. It's Deborah Levitt and I'm here for the start of season 3. I can't believe that it's already season 3. I can't believe that it's already the third week of January, and I can't believe that it's 2019. How on earth did that happen? Anyway, this episode is going to be a little bit different because I just want to talk to you about some of my experiences at the beginning of the year and some of my challenges that I faced in putting out the Microbiz Matters podcast. Because while I talk to lots of other people and, sometimes you'll hear the challenges that I had through that conversation, this time I had a great time, but I also had a lot of challenges, and I want to share those with you and the steps that I took to overcome some of those challenges as much as I could, and the steps that I'll be taking to prevent that from happening in the future. So I hope that you'll enjoy hearing about them. I'll also be talking to you a little bit about some of my upcoming guests for season 3. You can expect a slightly shorter episode this time around, and you can also expect some amazing guests coming up. So let's go. This year started with me running at a full pelt to get the Microbiz Matters, a 7-day podcast, out every day. My conversations with Tony Robinson and Tina Bowden started on the 3rd of January, with the first podcast going out on the 4th of January. And this became a much bigger task than I'd originally anticipated. I was expecting to have, maybe just, 10 minutes, maybe 15 minutes that I would put together that would be talking about, a little bit about the build up to Microbiz Matters Day, learning from Tony and Tina about the challenges they were having, the excitement, who was going to be there, and, all sorts of things. So I was really looking forward to it. And don't get me wrong, I'm absolutely thrilled that I did it. There's no regret whatsoever. But what I wasn't expecting was the amount of work that I inadvertently created, mainly for myself, to be honest, because what I did was assumed that because I had processes in place, that my normal podcast runs, fairly smoothly. I know what I'm doing. I know what I'm speaking to people about. I have a process for how guests are, signed up, how they get information to me. Everything is just, it already works. And even the podcasts that I've done, which have been a little bit different, have, required a bit of learning, but haven't had the same amount of information as I suppose I found this time. So I went into this knowing that there was going to be some pressure because I was doing it every day, but not really expecting the pressure that I ended up with. And I wanted to share this with you because I think that, again, as I mentioned in the introduction, we hear about challenges, from lots of different people. And I wanted to share that as somebody who is kind of into processes and planning, it can still does go wrong. So I quite happily decided, we've agreed times. Tony, Tina, and I will meet for several days in a row. We'll have a nice chat. We'll get some audio down, and I'll be able to pull that out and put that into a podcast. I then decided that I would also interview some additional business owners just to supplement it, to give some views about micro business from their perspective, to see what they could do for the hashtag I Gave 11 campaign. And, I just thought it would be a nice thing to do. But this added to the complexity of what I was trying to do. So I went from a process that is pretty well defined, from something that I'm familiar with, that I know how to put it all together, to not only having a completely different style of podcast, but a huge amount of data, of audio data that I don't normally have to deal with, and to the pressure of trying to get this out every day, bearing in mind that I started talking to Tony and Tina on the 3rd, and my first podcast went out on the 4th, and it was going out every day thereafter. And I soon realized that I was going to have to take some steps to protect myself and to make sure that I just didn't go completely crazy with all of the pressure that was now on myself. One of the first things that I did was to take away the pressure that I had put on myself. My goal was to put this podcast out for the start of every day. But I soon realized that that just wasn't going to happen. I wasn't doing nothing that week. I had lots of other things on. I was speaking, I had meetings, I had all sorts of things going on, as well as doing these interviews with the other business owners. So I realized that that was quite simply not viable, and that I was just going to have to accept that they would go out when they were finished, and that they would be finished at some point on that day, but not first thing in the morning as I would have hoped. So ideally, I was planning to finish it the day before. So that was my first realization. And I was a little disappointed in myself. But then I realized that, again, this was a very different situation to the situation I was normally in. And as a result, I couldn't expect to get it out within the timeline that I'd initially anticipated. The second thing that I needed to do was, having opened it up and said to people, if you'd like to be interviewed, if you're interested, was to draw the line on how many people I could interview and how that was being managed. So I essentially got to a point, it was actually only on the Saturday, so this was all happening very quickly, where I said, you know what? If you don't have an interview already booked with me, I can't do any more. There's, so it's fine if I'm interviewing you and it's scheduled for Wednesday, that's fine. But if you're not already booked in, I can't interview you. However, I appreciate that, people were wanting to put their time in, were wanting to talk about this and be involved. So I stepped back and took some time to record what my questions were. Because again, this was another difference to my normal style. I had set questions that I was asking people. And I recorded that, I made it available, and I said to those that were still interested, if you're interested and you want to be involved, I'd love to hear from you. You can listen to this, either record yourself answering the questions or write them down, and you need to get them to me by the end of the day on Monday. Because again, I'd suddenly realized that I couldn't keep accepting these through the week, that I had to draw the line. And I didn't really like doing that because I didn't want to sort of shut people away when I'd open the door for them. But I realized that was the only way that I could manage it, especially since the last episode was going out on Thursday and I had interviews on the Tuesday and the Wednesday as well, which meant that those somehow had to go into this week's podcast. My realization was that whilst it was a little bit uncomfortable, I did have to set some boundaries. I had to protect myself and also to protect that podcast. So it was a real, learning experience. And it was something that one side of me thought, well, I should have known. But the other side, because it was all so fast moving, accepts that it was a really fast moving environment. I couldn't have anticipated it. Not with the time frames that it all happened in. I will next time. And I dealt with it as best I could. Because on top of this, and on top of the other things that were already in my diary that were happening as well, the other thing that I encountered was the massive amount of data that I was generating. And I have hours of audio. I have all of the audio from the conversations that Tony and Tina and I had. I have the interviews with the 8 different business owners that I interviewed. In that week, I also did one of my normal interviews for one of the episodes coming up. So while it's separate audio, that was another piece of my brain that was trying to shift back into normal interview mode with a guest and a longer discussion and no set questions. And so I had all of this information. And that in itself has proven a challenge. And I haven't been able to fix that. I will. But at the time, I just suddenly discovered that this was very different to the normal style of interview and the normal style of podcast that I do. I wasn't taking an entire clip from somebody as I did with the people at the Lead Gen. I wasn't taking an entire interview as I normally do. And it wasn't just me talking. Now what I had to do was I had to go through and I had to find excerpts and pieces of my conversation with Tony and Tina. And I had to pull those out. I had to pull in the information from the different interviews that I'd done and either do a nice little link to those to tie it in some way to what Tony and Tina were saying. I had to do little segments where I was talking about what was going to come up next and how it was all going to link together. And all of that takes time. Added to that was the fact that because I don't normally deal with this much data, I didn't have, and I still don't have, a means of managing it. So I would be looking at it going, oh shoot, did I, which bit of Jake, I know Jake was in that episode, but I can't remember which bit of the conversation I had with Jake that I've included in it. And because I was listening to the audio so many times, I was listening to little snippets to remind myself of what somebody had said, that it just all sounded like it might have been in an episode. So this was a really big challenge for me and a really big factor in how long it took me to put the episodes together. So my learning from this is that, again, going forward, because I will want to do this type of podcast again, is one, don't have the discussion on the 2nd of January so that you start on the 3rd of January. We had been talking about it. This was not a decision that was only struck on this particular day. It's just that with Christmas in the middle, it just kind of crept up on us and came out of nowhere where it's like, oh my goodness, I've got to start now. The other thing is to make sure that I've planned out some of those other interviews in advance, that I'm taking them into account. And then, and this is going to take some time, I need to put a process in place to manage my audio. So on top of the processes that I already have, I now need a different process that's going to allow me to keep track of what people were talking about, what point in the audio file they're talking about it, and whether or not I've already used that segment or not. Because I'll tell you what, my brain was ready to explode. I was so happy when I got the episode out on Thursday, and I knew that I didn't have to put one out on Friday, that I could just turn up at the allocated time of 7:45 a.m. to participate in the digital know-how session with Tina. It was an immense relief. So the point of this isn't so that you can be going, oh, poor Deborah, feel really sorry for her. It's that sometimes when we're faced with something new, when we're faced with something different, we encounter obstacles and they can feel really painful to try and get through. And it can be tempting to just look back on it and say, okay, well, I'm never doing that again. But the reality is that through it, you need to decide what things you can put in place there and then. So what I did is I put in the boundaries around when I would accept interviews from other people. So that was a boundary put in sort of late in the day. I said no more. I accepted that I couldn't hit the timeline or the deadline that I had set myself and just allowed that to move. And then the rest, I acknowledged that I was going to have to do something about it, but I couldn't do that until after the week of podcasts happened. I also didn't put out the wrap-up podcast that I had been intending to do on that Sunday because there were other priorities, other things that had slipped because of the amount of work involved that I just needed to go, no, do you know what? This is a priority. And I had to allow myself to do that and accept that it was okay. So when you encounter that situation, when you encounter those obstacles, when you encounter something which is just making you feel, it might be making you feel that you're no good at doing it, or it might be making you feel just really stressed or really tired, don't let it stop you. Take a step back. Decide what you can do about it. What small steps you can implement there and then. And then they might be teeny. They might just make a little teeny bit of a difference. Look at how long it's going to go on for. And then acknowledge that you're going to have to make changes afterwards. But hitting these situations, hitting this type of, in my case, complete madness for a week, isn't a reflection on you or your overall abilities. It's a reflection on something which just happened. and that you know you're going to be able to do better the next time. And I know, I have absolute confidence that the next time I do this, whether it's for Microbiz Matters Day 2020, whether it's for other podcasts, before then, I know that I will do better because I know what I need to change. I know what some of the boundaries are, and I know that it will be easier on myself and also better for, in my case, my listeners. So I hope that you found this, useful and interesting. I really just wanted to share my experience of that whole process and that whole time, and just how hectic it was, and a little bit about how it made me feel as I was going through it as well, because I did feel absolutely shattered. I felt I'd let myself down until I gave myself permission to not hit those timelines. If you've had similar experiences where you felt really challenged and you've had to push yourself through, but you've then recognized what needs to change afterwards, do drop me a note. You can drop me an email, or you can send me an audio recording. I'd ask you to keep them less than 5 minutes because, again, otherwise I'll be back to that mass of audio that I've got to figure out what to do with. But I'd love to hear from you, and I'd love to hear about other people's experiences. So before I wrap up, let me tell you about some of the other guests and episodes that you can expect in season 3. One, I interviewed the absolutely amazing Lenka Lutonska. Lenka is, well, her group is freaking amazing, and she is absolutely amazing. Her story is, well, really incredible. She talks about how she had everything, lost it completely, and has rebuilt her business, and how she's been letting go of things to allow herself space to move forward. And it's a really lovely story to hear from Lenka. I also have spoken to Craig Goldblatt. He's the one who I squeezed in the middle of all of that Microbiz Matters Day podcasting. And Craig is an inspirational speaker, and I'll tell you what, he is inspirational. It was just, you think, oh, she says this about everybody, but you know what? He was and is. It was just really lovely meeting with him and talking about him and hearing about some of the things that he's done and is doing for people in Africa. We talked about some of the impact that him doing that can have on them, the positives, the negatives, and really, I can't wait till you hear this, that particular episode as well. Also spoken to Richard Dwyer. Now, Richard is somebody who started his business really young, and he started it really as a means to an end. He needed to pay for training so that he could become a stuntman. So he used his gymnastics experience to start a gymnastics business for school children whilst training to become a stuntman, and he became a very successful stuntman. At the same time, building his business. He's now stepped away from the stuntman business and is focusing on the gymnastics business. And he and I'll be honest with you, our conversation is just about 2 hours. I will be going through it and looking for how to either take pieces out of it or to split it into 2 so that you can get something a little bit more bite-sized. But just, again, another hugely interesting and inspirational man. And we talk about the culture in a business. We talk about the need to consciously define one, because whatever you do, your company or your business will have a culture. And we talk about loads of stuff. So anyway, so those are 3 of my amazing guests coming up. I have other people who are lined up, but I don't like to talk about them until I've got the interviews kind of in the bag. One, though, that I do want to mention to you is Richard Woods. And as you probably know, I interviewed Richard last year. I've also was at his Lead Gen Summit. I have a lot of time for Richard. He's somebody who is incredibly generous with his knowledge and experience, and has a really strong desire to want to help you and to support you. So I interviewed Richard for the Microbiz Matters Day, and you've heard probably just a teeny snippet where we're talking about definitions of success. But I want to share that entire interview with you because he gives some great advice and he's really open and honest. So at some point you will hear that entire interview, and you'll also hear the more from the other business owners that I interviewed as well, because they had so much more wonderful stuff to say that I just couldn't fit in. So you can expect to hear more about Microbiz Matters generally. You can expect to hear from Richard Woods specifically. And also I had a little wrap-up session that I did with Tina Bowden just Fridays to see how she was feeling after Microbiz Matters and, a week on. So we'll have that chat as well. And I'm hoping, and we'll see how this pans out, that I might be able to get on some of the young entrepreneurs that were part of Microbiz Matters Day, because again, there were some amazing stories in there. So lots of excitement, lots of things coming up, and I hope that you're as excited about season 3 as I am. And as I said, if you've got any experiences that you want to share about overcoming challenges, then either drop me an email, Deborah, Debra, at bridginggaps.uk, or record yourself. No more than 5 minutes, please. Make sure you include your full name and all of those details and send it through to the same email address. If it's a really large file, if you can send me a link to it either on Dropbox or Google, something along those lines. So anyway, that brings us to the end of the first official episode of season 3, and I will see you next week. The number of people listening to podcasts is increasing year on year as people look to break free from their screen and consume information on the go. If you'd like to know more about podcasts, then please go to whatsthisIhear.bridginggaps.uk. Are you considering your own podcast? Why not check out So You Think You Want Your Own Podcast? It's an online course that introduces you to everything that's involved in hosting a podcast, as well as working with you to define your own podcast concept. You can get more information on it at startyourownpodcast.bridginggaps.uk. Bridging Gaps, the business podcast, was produced by Deborah Levitt of Bridge Road Consultants Limited, with original music provided by Pete Dineley.
You've been listening to Deborah Levitt on Bridging Gaps, the business podcast.